everyone, and welcome to What Fresh Hell, Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy. And this week we're asking the question, is there just too much parenting information out there?
I mean, the answer, Amy, is yes. Thanks you
for
all
listening.
for listening
Right.
to this episode. Be sure to
Right.
subscribe.
I have some gray areas for you. There's some studies. I got some research. I am here to argue that sometimes the information that we can gain for ourselves definitely helps with some tricky situations. And of course, there's times when it can be overwhelming and way too much.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be our old friend, the double-edged sword. But
Yeah.
all right,
Shall
start
we
us off, Amy.
All right,
You're in charge today.
The problem is information overload, right? So what is
Right.
information overload? Let's define that. Like presumably the only problem with too much information is overload. So information overload, I'm going with a professional definition here. We're going to define it as the tipping point when the input of information exceeds an individual's capacity to process it. There's more coming in than you can process.
Is that the only problem, that I can't process it? Or is there also a huge problem that I wish I just didn't know the information?
Well, information overload can also involve feeling overwhelmed and stressed by the information one receives.
Okay,
right?
This is more my problem.
This is, I think what we're saying is there's a point where what is it called? The Dunning-Kruger effect. The less you know about something, the more you think you know about it. Like, who's the famous astrophysicist? Who's like the fun?
I'll go with fun ties? Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil deGrasse Tyson. Like Neil deGrasse Tyson would be like, we know nothing about deep space, right? Like
that's fine with me.
But what I'm saying is he spent his whole life studying it, and he would tell you he's only begun to scratch the surface of what there is to know. Whereas the typical 10-year-old that just studied the planets and science is like, oh, I know a lot about the solar system. I got all the facts. The less you know, the more you think you know. The more you study, the more overwhelmed you are by how much there is to know.
I think that's true. And I do think in general that I'm not a big head in the sand as a go-to, but I do feel strongly that I know too much.
Well, there's a point where, the information searching can lead you to feel more confused than knowledgeable.
More nervous. That's my problem.
Oh, okay.
I'm not worried about what I know and what I don't know in terms of mastery of knowledge. I feel like I was happier not knowing so many things that I know. Ignorance is bliss, Amy. I think that's my kind of default.
Well, I mean, to start with the obvious sort of third rail and the one that everybody's dealt with in the last couple of years, like vaccines, like dealing with it right now. Like, should my kid get the vaccine? Is it available if I want to get it? Should they get it if they had COVID within the last 4 months? Should they get it if they've never had COVID? Should. There is no one good source of information on that. There's approximately 75,000 people who have hung out a shingle and declared themselves experts with completely contradictory advice. And the more you look into it, the more confused you get.
I mean, I have to push back on that. I think that I trust doctors more than other people.
Let me say, yeah, like I'm going to get my kid, I have a history with COVID. My kids are going to get vaccinated, but I understand that if you go looking for the best information for the right answer, even doctors are sort of like, yeah, it's confusing at this point.
Are they about vaccine? I don't want to go down a vaccine rabbit hole, but I definitely don't want to stand on vaccines are super confusing. I think the majority of the medical community is in full agreement that vaccines are good.
Well, we should at least be in agreement upon. I think we've coined a new word.
Yes,
agreement.
I just used the word agreement because someone told it to me a long time ago, and I think it's a funny word, so I like to use it. But there's no such word as agreement. But I do like to use it.
That not getting COVID is better than getting COVID. Like, can we be in agreement on that? I'm not even so sure we all agree on that anymore,
I do
but
think
that's the truth.
That vaccines, to me, is an example of the problem with the microphone size.
Yes.
There are people who are experts, and there are people who have large microphones, and that they're not the same thing.
Yes.
I think that, can you find some doctors who are like, the vaccines are bad? You certainly can. But I like to just default to experts know more than other people. And therefore, if the American Medical Association says get a vaccine, I'm getting that vaccine.
Mhm.
Now, do sometimes things go wrong with vaccines? Yes. I
Sure.
remember talking to my pediatrician. Actually, it was my sister-in-law's mom, who is a pediatrician. And I said, I'm concerned about the vaccines because I hear all this stuff. And she's like, listen, no one's going to guarantee you that nothing's ever going to go wrong. Whenever you get an injection, there's a risk of infection. There's a risk with everything. But polio, the risk of polio is much, 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 much worse than the risk from the polio vaccine. You should get the vaccine. And I was like, oh, thanks for explaining that to me. Great. I then don't feel a need to go on Twitter and hear what like Gary 056 Ohio has to say about vaccines too. I trust my experts. And I think in general that we've kind of lost the idea. I mean, back in the day, the president spoke from like this position of authority and people didn't really question the president. You know, it was like he was the leader.
Like 2001, you know, like
yes. Back in the day,
after 9/11, Bush talked and we're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We can like it, we can not like it. We're united.
But this is what we're doing. And we had a recent issue with our local church, and that was really kind of crazy and out of bounds. And the priest did something kind of crazy. And a group of moms wrote a letter, held a meeting, and like 3 or 4 of the women in that group said that their mothers were appalled that they were questioning the priest. That like the idea that you would question a priest was so out of bounds to them, even though for our generation, we were like, well, they did something crazy and someone has to tell them it's crazy so that we can have a better church. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Like there's obviously, as we do not need to explain, tons of problems with priests being ultimate authorities who are never questioned.
Any unquestioned authority figure, right?
I don't think that, like, we don't live in a dictatorship. I think it's great that people are like voicing more questions about authority. But there is this clear downside that like if everyone's authority is equal, we're in total chaos. And I don't want to have to process like when I used to live in California, they have ballot measures where you vote on like whether or not that we should form. They have ballot measures. And the issue is something like, should we spend money to dam the blah, blah, blah river that I've never heard of? And then all of the ads on TV are like, if you dam this river, every single piece of wildlife will die and you will be a monster. And then like you watch another ad and it's like, if we don't dam this river, you might as well drown yourself in the bathroom today because that is what is going to happen. And I just think I want my elected representative to research this and vote correctly. I don't want to be involved. I don't want all this information about the dams. I want the person I elected to make this decision, you know?
Yeah, right. Of course. Like back in the day where you did what the pediatrician said and the pediatrician would pat you on the head and said, you know, there's something wrong with my kid. But lots of kids didn't get the stuff they needed.
Right.
And many's the time I've read the story about the mom knew something was wrong. The mom knew something was wrong and she was patronized and sent home and there's something wrong. So there is something to be said for being the expert on yourself and your kid, but of course it can go too far. So I want to sort of dial like where's the right amount, because I think there's too much and I think there's not enough. This was an interesting statistic that I saw, that most parents today report using the internet for parenting advice every single day. Googling something, researching something. I mean,
let me just say thank God for you people, because it keeps us in business. Thank God. We are parenting.
You should listen to What Fresh Hell every day.
You don't Google, just listen to this podcast.
We're here to be like, here's what some people say, here's what some other people say. We think you got to figure it out for yourself. I mean, I feel like that this is what we do every single week.
That seems insane to me.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't know, maybe it's hard for us to parse out because it's our business but that seems insane to me. Like, I can't remember even before doing the podcast when I had really little kids being on the internet and looking stuff up. I mean, I guess it would.
Did you use message, like back in the early 2000s when my kids were little, we're talking like 2005, 2007, there were message boards, almost like a Facebook group would be now, where you could ask questions, get questions answered. And I would look at those. but they were anonymous. So they would get mean and they would get snarky. So then at some point I was like, why am I listening to, Paula P265 tell somebody?
I don't know. I it's hard for me to parse out. Certainly I had a child who had a diagnosis going on. I Googled that almost obsessively, and to the point where I had to cut myself off to be like, this is not actually
because there was
helping
information
me.
overload where you got overwhelmed instead of, it made you feel worse instead of better.
Well, and it is that kind of situation where you just read 10 things and you get 10 different pieces of advice. And it's like, okay, this is actually useless. And I think, I don't know. That doesn't sound familiar to me. Googling something once a day seems
Every day.
insane
Yeah.
to me.
And it's also true, same study, that mothers do this more often. Because I think so many of us are default parents. But the study underlined the very obvious thing that, like, my husband wasn't looking up, like, today your baby is the size of a
melon,
and tomorrow it's the size. Like, he wasn't
doing that.
Nearly as enchanted.
He was, however, making this sound when you told him at the dinner table. Huh. That was his contribution.
Right. I was definitely a little bit more interested in every, wonder of my changing body. So I did get into it during pregnancy. I think more books than internet then. But at least with books, there's some, like, somebody had to care enough about this to print this, unless you're getting a self-published book. Like, there's some modicum of fact-checking that happens in Baby Talk magazine that doesn't happen when somebody just sort of says something on the internet. And I think that there's been this sort of democratization of microphone, which is great. Like, it's great for us. We have an independent podcast. We built an audience. We don't have to work for NPR. But on the other hand, it does mean anybody can tell you any old thing. And it kind of feels, we can sometimes misperceive it as right because it's on the internet.
I mean, this is the big problem, is that somebody said, not original to me, everyone has the same size microphone. And that's kind of insane. Like, even people who know you should have a bigger size microphone. And then I would strenuously argue that people who went to medical school should have a bigger size microphone about medical things. And astrophysicists should have a bigger size microphone. It doesn't mean they never make mistakes. It just means democratization.
Democratization, yes.
Of information, I find very crazy.
It's a little bit complicated. But we've all dealt with, like, I've had this experience. My kid had like an ear infection and was, like, raging at the pediatrician, like, definitely, like, taken over by a demon.
Demons, yes.
That needed to be expelled. But an exorcism wasn't available, it being the 21st century. So here I was at the pediatrician, and I had a young resident, male, explain to me that my child was misbehaving and I needed to correct this at home, that this wasn't anything they could deal with in the office, that I needed to take my child home, put my child in their room, and hold the door closed, hold the doorknob closed, and not let them out until they stopped crying. And I knew that was a person in a white coat giving me bad information.
But I have to put a large, bright line between bad anecdotal experiences with goofy individuals.
Yes.
And rejection of medical advice overall.
For sure.
Yeah.
And
they're just,
there's a lot more anecdotally bad advice.
Right. With anybody.
Right.
But doctors know more than non-doctors when it comes to medicine. Like,
for sure. And parents know more than non-parents when it comes to discipline. Like, let's be clear. This was somebody leaving their lane. This was like a 24-year-old dude telling me how to parent better. And it was fine because I was like, oh, really? I actually was so amused by it in the moment. I was sort of like, really? And then what should I do? And then what if he tries to get out? And then, like, tell me everything, Dr. Spock. I was kind of, priming him for more because I was so outraged by what he was telling me. So that's, yes. Would I listen to them about, like, when they look in their ear, does it look infected or not? 100%. Right. But sometimes people leave their lanes and still act like they know everything. And it can be harder to discern that. How about this? Harder to discern that on an internet post than it would be when I look at this guy like, you just graduated from medical school like 2 weeks ago and you're definitely not a dad, and I definitely am not going to worry about whether or not you think
your
I'm
dumb
a parent.
opinion.
Yeah.
I think I have a major key to this topic that kind of unlocks maybe something central to what's going on. Let's take a break, Amy, and I will show you my key.
Okay.
I think a huge problem that exists fundamental to parenting is the need for control that is unfillable and it's an unscratchable itch for control.
Certainty, right?
Certainty and control. Certainty is part of control.
Right, or at least it feels that
Bad
way.
things happen to children that are out of our control. They get sick. They get terrible diseases, viruses. They fall. They get into accidents. There are 1,000 possible things that could happen to any given child on any given day that are beyond our control. And we know about these things and we hear about these things. And so we seek the illusion of control that we think can be found in information.
Right. Or at least some of us do. Like, that's definitely my, like, the more I know, the more certain I'll feel, the more in control I'll feel.
I think that's most people, that somehow that we are so uncomfortable. And I don't mean like we're so stupid and uncomfortable. I mean, it is such a disquieting and uncomfortable feeling to feel that we have no control over the bad things that are going to happen, that we seek that control everywhere. I sometimes seek that control, as I have discussed, by tapping things in a very specific order because I have OCD. And like, do I actually believe that like tapping the picture on my left when every time I leave my bedroom is doing anything? No, I guess not rationally, but like, can I stop doing it? No. Did my therapist tell me it's morally neutral and that it's fine if it makes me feel better? Yes.
Yeah,
so
if
I
it keeps your
continue
blood
to
pressure
do it.
down, then
Lowers
then
my
it's
blood
harmless.
pressure.
Yeah, okay.
But I do think that this like relentless like information industrial complex is being fed fundamentally by like, if I know enough, I can stop bad things happening. And that is a fool's game to a certain degree.
So there's something happening with Google in recent years that is also going to make this, I think, harder. The word, this guy Cory Doctorow writes about it, and I'm going to call it messupification. He uses a more colorful word.
Okay.
Slang word. It's messupification, that a company's software, what they promise you, starts to get messed up on purpose. So this blew my mind when I understood this. Like, have you noticed that Google search is starting to get a little more confusing? When you do Google something, if you Google a hotel, like the actual website for the hotel is like 10th on the page now. And more than once I've clicked on, just the other day I bought Broadway tickets from like some weird scalper website, and I thought I was going to the Broadway show to buy tickets, but instead I was served an ad and I ended up paying like a fee I didn't have to pay. So the reason that's happening is that it's for two reasons. One is Google allows paid advertising, right? So you can pay to have your I'm a baby expert now. I'm a baby sleep expert. My results can appear at the top of a Google search by spending a little bit of money, and then it'll appear above St. Jude's Hospital or something, right? But the other thing that's going on is that if Google gets too good, too efficient as a search engine, then we don't stay. Our searches are short because we get what we need and we leave. And in order for there to be eyeballs, in order to serve you more ads, the search needs to get harder. So when you go looking for this information, if you go looking for, like I said, a hotel, or like my baby's pulling on her ear, is that an earache or not, you're kind of more likely to be served a really muddy page of search results than you were just a couple of years ago. And I think we don't perceive that yet. We perceive that the search results at the top of the page are going to be the most reliable. They're the most heavily indexed. They're not. They're the ones that we're paid for. And so it just means that when you do go search, there's a lot of sludge, and a lot of the stuff at the top is more suspect, but it doesn't feel that way to us. We think it should be the most reliable because it's at the top.
Yeah. And this is similar to shopping sites that I didn't really understand this until fairly recently, that's paid too. That the things that pop out that you're not actually getting, like, why did I somehow think that you could just pop something into search and like the 3 best ones come up first? Like, of course they don't. The 3 ones that paid extra come up first.
Right.
And it is the information that you're getting is not necessarily the best information. And I would also argue when it comes to information, that is the information even always information you need? That's what I wonder about. Like, do you need to know that that bump that is 90% likely to be a pimple or an ingrown hair? I mean, it could also be, some grievous form of cancer that's going to murder you within the next 6 months. Like, it's just, I do think there is too much information. And I don't like to be arguing in favor of ignorance, but I do think the overconnectedness, and we've talked about this with social media experts and stuff too, that the ability to make stupid mistakes and be ignorant in your small community is now like, oh, someone put that on TikTok and now you can't, function in the world when you're 40.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to quote Laura Love Hardin. She was a Fresh Take guest we had a couple months ago, and it wasn't about making mistakes online necessarily, but she said, I am not the worst thing I have ever done. We all, each of us, are more than the worst thing we've ever done. And I thought, right. But not when our teenagers, ill-advised thing is going to haunt them during their college search. It's
hard now. The worst thing you've ever done is like supremely Googleable.
Right. Very available.
And I certainly know people who have used genetic websites, that trace your DNA and your ancestry and found out really difficult information. I also know people who have, decades ago made decisions about babies they were having or giving away or not having, and that events that they thought they had completely left behind for very, very, very solid and valid reasons. And yeah, I mean, our ability to be private, to keep secrets, is disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's a lot harder to murder people. Like, there are some upsides. But I think that information is just so ultimately, and it's kind of annoying to talk about it in this way because it's like, wah, wah, but it is so double-edged swordsy. Like, I was thinking that the other day just about politics and information and the thing with the priests. Like, there was something nice about being like, this dude, this like old white dude is in charge. Everybody go about your day. Like, you don't have to worry about.
You're not supposed to wonder, right? You're not supposed to question.
There was something very freeing and calming about that. And then there was obviously the huge downside that, like, those people elevated only people who look like them and were of the same social class. Like, I am not ignorant to the problems of, like, this dude is in charge. No one ask any questions. But the dismantling of that has a certain pain that goes with it as well. And like, I was thinking about those old ladies being, they're not that old, but like, I was thinking about the moms being like, don't ever question the priest. That's not your job. And like, it seems laughable to us, but
it wasn't that long ago. You're saying it
and
wasn't.
I kind of get it. Like, it's kind of nice to be like, we were at a mass thing the other day, and one of the priest was asking, it was a little kid's mask, and it was a little kid mask, and the priest was saying, who knows you the best? And this little kid raised his hand and he said, you do. And he's like, well, I don't know you as well as your dad, though. And he's like, but you're God. You know us the best. And like, I definitely remember the phase of my life where like my kids thought the priest was God. They did not get the distinction of like, this is just the guy in the outfit representing. And it was just making me laugh. But like, there is something nice about being like, oh, the priest is just God. Like, just go with that. No further questions.
I have a study. Can we talk about this study? Because I thought this was kind of interesting.
Yes.
All right. So 2 professors of psychology and parent-child relationships, I'll put the link in the show notes. They decided to study how searching for information online is linked to parental self-efficacy. So that was what they were sort of solving for. So they call parental self-efficacy a parent's belief that you can do a good job parenting your kid. So it's kind of like self-confidence. I'll call it self-confidence just because parental self-efficacy is long. So does searching online affect self-confidence? They studied 200 mothers, all Swedish. So your mileage may vary, but these are These
Oh,
were people in Sweden.
don't compare yourself to the
So it's
Swedes.
small. It's a small study, but it was interesting, and I saw this reported a bunch of places. So the results, they suspected that the more you searched online, the less secure that you would become, the less confident you would become. And that also that people who were already pretty self-confident in their parenting probably didn't do very much searching. So they got sort of mixed results on their hypothesis. They found that parents who weren't self-confident did search online more frequently for information than parents who were.
Checks out.
Makes sense, right? I would certainly look about something I wasn't self-confident about. So you're more likely to search online for stuff when you're not feeling confident. But searching more didn't make parents' confidence either increase or decrease. It wasn't like the more you searched, the more confident you became, or the more you searched, the less confident you became. They found that just sort of like confident parents didn't search that much and less confident parents did, but it was a lack of confidence that caused the searching, not the searching causing the lack of confidence. Which I
Yeah, as soon as you started talking about this survey, I was like, wait a minute. Like, clearly there's a defining principle here that, like, less confident people would search more.
Right.
That definitely tracks. But I also think it's so in the groundwater also. Like, that's the thing. You don't necessarily have to be a person in search of parenting advice. If you're using social media, you are seeing people parenting performatively all over the place. You are seeing that, like, this kid, got into this school, or this kid made this team, or look at how they're all sitting around and doing a hot cocoa party on a Thursday afternoon. Like, you're getting a lot of passive imagery about both people who are performing parenting well, and also we just had a post the other day on my town Facebook page about, somebody left their kid in the car. Don't you know that kidnappers are everywhere, and they could grab kids out of the car. You're getting a lot of passive messages about, like, dangers to kids, or my kid's in the hospital, they broke their leg, they had an allergic reaction. I just feel like you don't even have to seek this information out to have it be being served to you very often.
That's right. Well, there was one sort of the first sort of takeaway I wanted to offer came from this study, which they did find that the effects of information overload. So it wasn't that it made you more or less confident, but it would make you feel more or less overwhelmed sometimes. This information overload could kick in. And they found that it was more likely to kick in when people just sort of like went to a search bar and typed in toothache, like my baby's cheeks are red. Is it a toothache? When they just sort of started by shouting into the wind, those people were more likely to report feeling overwhelmed and confused by the information they received than people who had a few trusted sources. They said governmental. I think we would probably call those like .orgs or .edus. Like childmind.org is one that leaps to mind. That's an excellent resource. That if you start there as sort of a source that you've trusted before, that is reliable, that is researched, that those people are less likely to be like, I don't know what to think now, because they picked one or two places and researched only those places.
Yeah, that makes sense. And people talk about this all the time about we should be educating kids and ourselves about, like, media literacy. And my kids do some assignments for health class, I think, but it is like, when you look at this website, like, is it a legitimate website or is it like a shaky website? And they kind of have them like parse stuff out about, like, okay, what's the address? What does it look like? And how to find good information online, because that's right. If you start in the void, you're going to be in big trouble.
Yes. Okay. More takeaways of ways to make this easier. We'll be right back. One of the takeaways I was going to offer was that your sort of tipping point for information overload might also vary it certainly varies, I would say, between you and me, that I'm more of a like, well, let's go see what the 10 experts have to say about this. And that's okay. Like, that's how we're wired. So it might take me longer to reach a point of information overload or not. And or also your parenting partner. Like, I'm definitely married to somebody who kind of counts on me.
Meaning what their
wonder about the
threshold or their want to know is.
Like, I'll do it. So why does he have to do it?
Right. And what their threshold is, right? What their desire to know is.
Right. And that's okay. I
Yeah.
don't think we have to convince everybody to have the same kind of approach to this information, but just to assess what's right for you.
For sure. And personally, I find that I draw some boundaries around my information wanting, and especially people who send around, like, here's 8 different ways that you could be involved in a house fire. I'm like, I just either delete them, I soft delete, or I'm like, I actually don't want to know this information. And I have found, especially since having kids, had very bad postpartum anxiety, that I am not available for certain conversations anymore. And I know that there are people who verbally process terrible events in the world by giving voice to the 86 hideous images of those events that they saw. And that is important and part of their process. But I have gotten better at saying, I can't do this. I find I'll be up all night worrying, or I have to stop some of the influx of information personally because I can't handle it.
And just knowing that is so important for like setting your own boundaries.
Yeah, and I have a little OCD stuff going on. I have some intrusive thought problems, and I perseverate on. I found I'm very careful about what movies I watch. Like, I'll get a gross image from a movie I saw in 1983 stuck in my head. I'm like, I do not need to put bad images in my head because I don't know why, but I perseverate on them. And so I don't want to do that.
You know, you're taking the advice that Kara Goodwin gave in Psychology Today. So she did an article sort of linking to this study we were just talking about in the previous section, and some tips for information overload. And that was kind of one we hadn't really touched on yet. Pay attention to your feelings, she says, while doing these information search. Do you feel more empowered and confident, or do you feel more ashamed and overwhelmed? When you start to feel overwhelmed, close the laptop.
Yeah, and I do think it can be hard. And I was there with a kid with a diagnosis that was extremely unclear, and the outcomes for that diagnosis seemed extremely wide and confusing to me. And I spent probably 6 months just Googling it obsessively and constantly. I mean, I was always on my laptop or on my phone searching for information, like at red lights, like insane. And people would tell me to stop, and I wasn't able to. I just couldn't. I don't know. I wasn't calm.
Were so high at the time.
Yeah, my stress. I felt it so clearly as a coping mechanism. And so, like touching the picture on the way out the door, if you are doing this and you are aware that you are doing it and it feels kind of neutral to you as an outlet for stress, I would say you do you. But it's not really great for you. It's not really great for you. And I think that it is okay. There aren't answers out there. And so if it's an exercise and it's like a self-stimulating behavior that is the only thing getting you through, accept it as that and move on. But to the degree that you can say, like, this is actually kind of harmful for me and I should try to cut down on it, I think listen to that voice if you can.
It occurs to me that I have found this sort of middle ground around, I have a kid with some chronic health issues, and they wax and wane with like how important they feel and how much I'm worrying about them at a given time. I don't get served a lot of articles on these things because I look at them, right? The algorithm, Big Brother knows. I like to look at articles on these things. That's another good point that I think we haven't really talked about. When you start searching for stuff, you're going to get served a lot more stuff about this. You're going to learn a lot more about like petechiae. I'm using that as a totally random example. Those red bumps could be petechiae. And you look up one article on it, then all of a sudden, your feeds are full of articles on this thing like everybody else is talking about it. No, they're not. They're just serving this to you. But what I've started to do is if I look at an article, I glance at the headline, I see it like, oh, that sounds like it could be useful to me at some point. Like, is vitamin D the answer? Like, could adding more turmeric to your diet help with energy levels? Whatever. I have a place where I file those, like an online filing cabinet, basically, an app that I use, and I save them. I don't read them. I save them. And I think like there might be someday that, and again, there are sources that I kind of trust, but even so, I don't need to read the article. If I know I might need it someday, just send it to that online thing. It's searchable later. If I need to find turmeric in 6 months, what was that thing about turmeric and headaches? I can find it, but I don't need to read it right now. And I don't need to try to like remember it, synthesize it, decide if it's important to change anything about what I'm doing. That'll be there if I need it. That's my sort of maybe touching the pictures thing that I sort of like, oh, it'll be there later if I don't need to look at it now because I have it for later if I need it. And then guess what? I have hundreds of things I haven't read.
And I do think that like finding that trusted source and delegating, I remember someone talking to me about business stuff. So you and I came from entertainment backgrounds and, now run a fairly sizable business all of a sudden. And I was doing X and Y and somebody was like, you really need to start figuring out like your delegation system, like who can do some of these things because you can't do everything now. You're too busy. And also like you're giving so much weight to stuff by going to X meeting or this thing. And like you have to delegate that. Like you have to think about like having ambassadors who go to things like now you're kind of the president. And what does that look like? And who are these ambassadors? And I think that for me, like ambassadors to information is another solution for me that like, I want that trusted person. And yes, I have tried 4 different doctors and now I have a pediatrician that I trust. I have a pediatrician in my extended family who I could always call and say, I've gotten 3 opinions on this. What would you do next? And I know people who are smart about different regions of the world and political stuff. And I'm pretty like, when I'm vote, I use a voter guide. I'm like, who aligns with my beliefs in the most ways possible? Let me get a voter guide and vote for people in that category who this group endorses. Because I know that I don't not want to research my local judge for a year. Like I'm good. I find that I'm not quite at like whatever the priest says goes, but I do tend towards like, I'm going to put in a little bit of work to find the thing that I trust. And I'm not going to go crazy diving into it 1,000 different ways. I'm going to ask my trusted person.
So that was like another Kara Goodman takeaway in this Psychology Today article, that your real life support network, when you are starting to feel overwhelmed. Yeah, my kid's pediatrician, perfect example. I would trust whatever she told me. Should we do this or that? What do you think of this, that? And I think we just have a really good relationship and she's fantastic. And so whatever she says, I can sleep at night because she knows best. And having that real life thing is the perfect antidote to what does AI think I should do? I mean,
and I do think that sometimes you're avoiding the answer by Googling. And that's also okay to acknowledge that like sometimes you're not quite ready. Maybe your trusted person is going to be like, this is a tough diagnosis and it is going to have lifetime implications. And you're not quite ready for that information. So you're out there desperate Googling. It's fine if you're doing that, but I think it's good to know that, that you actually, it's like, maybe you're not making a budget because there's no way to make the money in your bank account pay the bills. Like, I get it. I've been there. And you're not always ready for the information.
Right.
But as long as you kind of know on some level that like, I'm pretending I have enough money because I hope I will soon, but right now I don't. It's fine to do that. I just don't think it's fine to do it in a way that is actually substituting for real information.
And for what you know to be true, right?
I'm sorry. There are real truths. There are truths and there are internet searches and they are not the same thing. Period.
You solved it.
If you're coming to me, I'm going to tell you.
There are truths. I'm going to say that again. There are truths and there are internet searches and they are not the same thing.
Not the same thing.
Unless you're listening to the What Fresh Hell podcast.
Everything we say is true.
Right.
And vaguely well-informed.
True, right.
And some of it does come from Googling people, I'm not going to lie. If you want an ultimate source of truth, it's the 5-star reviews of this podcast on Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, for
they
some
are
reason,
all true if they are 5 stars. If they are 1 stars, they are misguided. But we are trying to up our reviews. Kind of a boring thing about the algorithm. We need 1,000. We have 800. Here's what we're asking today. Would you go review this podcast on Apple Podcasts and say how much you like it and how it's your one source of truth. We would
give us some
appreciate that
stars.
very
You can write a
much.
review also. Everyone would help. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, that would be so nice of you. And with that, stop that Googling, friends. Go out and take a
Put your phone
walk.
down.
Enjoy do some leaf peeping, and we will talk to you next time.
So long.